Miroslav, first of all, thank you so much for coming and taking the time to come and talk with us. If I could ask you a few questions. Firstly, when did you first come to Australia and what brought you here?
Okay. What brought me to Australia? I guess adventure. You know, the feeling of going somewhere that's actually very far from troubled Europe of that time. Czechoslovakia, as it was then, was just invaded by Russia and its allies, or Soviet Union and its allies, and I didn't feel like I could live under that regime for more years, and as it turned out, became much more brutal actually, compared to what it was leading up to '68, which was, to me, it was a time of optimism. You know, that things could have. There was a hope that things would have changed under socialism with human faces, they called it. Anyway, it was such a disappointing time for us after invasion. So at the point I stayed in Vienna, contemplating whether I should be returning or not. Spoke to my father on the phone several times, and he said, "Look, we'll miss you." You know, my mother died many years before that, so I only had a father who remarried, had a new family. He said, "We'll miss you, but it's not going to be good. If you can stay out." He was hoping I'd stay somewhere in Europe, you know, but...
Could you describe your beginnings in Australia in the first few years?
First years in Australia, first couple of years, were difficult. Not knowing many people. I mean, even though I had an uncle here in Fairfield, who came here in 1950, I think 51 or something like it. It was my mother's brother. He was married to a Russian woman, so every time we talked about Russians, how awful awful they were, you know, invading us, she would get upset. You know, she was still very proud Russian. So you know, we stayed with them in Fairfield for a couple of weeks, and then I found a place. I was actually searching. Fairfield was such a dead place, you know. I was searching for some life in Sydney. I think somebody told me there was a bit of jazz. There's a jazz club at King's Cross. So I found a jazz club, started meeting musicians, and moved to King's Cross. Actually, you know, that felt to me like almost like a European. It was bohemian at that point. King's Cross wasn't full of strip clubs, and you know, there was a bit of life there actually. And so I found a little flat in the middle of King's Cross. My flat actually later became a jazz club also. Not because of me, but you know, somebody bought that house or the kind of apartment block, and that became a jazz club for many years.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
And how would you compare Australia and the Czech Republic from all your experience here?
Well, everything was totally different. You know, really. I mean, the fact that I found something that kind of reminded me of Europe, which was at King's Cross, and that kind of softened the blow a little bit, you know. But certainly, my first impression of Australia, which was Fairfield, you know, suburbia, I hated it. You know, I thought I made a mistake. But eventually, I started meeting friends and musicians, and you know, at that point, of course, Australia had a policy of assimilation. You know, it wasn't built before multiculturalism. You know, you're supposed to become, they used to call us the new Australians. You know, I found it reasonably easy to, you know, once I started meeting like-minded people, musicians or artists and people like that. to assimilate to that, you know. But it was, you know, for a while it was very difficult to actually find, say, music playing jobs, you know. So I formed a little band from the immigrants I knew, you know. There was a Slovak drummer and a Slovak piano player who was a great architect, by the way, Fedor Metek. Bass player from Brno, who used to play in some rock band in Brno, who later became a fantastic classical bass player. Studied classical bass and played with the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra for many years. Ivan Sultanov. So that was my first band, you know, Czech musicians, Czechoslovak musicians. And then later I started finding work in clubs through Australian musicians, Australian friends, and then studios and big bands, and eventually it led to more work in music, you know, playing with some pop bands. I mean, Marsha Hines you probably know about her. Yeah. She was a pop star, huge pop star, like a queen of pop for many years. So I played with her for years, you know.
And is there anything you miss about the Czech Republic?
Czech Republic. I do miss the culture still. Still, every time I go there, I think, okay, this place still has a lot of culture and a long history of culture. Australia is a relatively young country, even though they have some great musicians, great artists, but the following, the audience, the people the consumers of culture are not maybe because of the tradition partly also, you know, and also the fact it's an immigration culture, you know, it's an immigration nation, so it is multicultural now, it's not monocultural. So the people that follow the mainstream Australian culture are mostly Australians, I think. You know, so it's different. It's actually very different.
And when you visit the Czech Republic now, is there anything you miss about Australia when you're over there?
Yeah. I guess I miss that Australian quality, the Australianness. You know, the nature and maybe certain attitudes. You know, there are certainly amongst the people that I associate with. There's a certain freedom of communication, but you know, this similar thing exists in that class of that level of society in Czech Republic also amongst artists. You know, people just think differently, maybe. You know, maybe not as materialistically, or you know, as a lot of Australians do now, or if many Czechs do now, become very materialistic.
And last question: is there anything else you'd like to mention, just for inspiration, or any final comments?
Well, yes. Inspiration-wise, absolutely. I mean, the multicultural thing inspires my music a lot. You know, I mean, just having the experiences. I played with African bands and Brazilian bands and you know, salsa bands like Cubans. All of that and jazz. You know, all of that informs my music or musical thinking, really. You know, so in a way, that is different. Even though, for instance, these days when I go to Prague, I hear Brazilian bands or Cuban bands also now, because some of those people live there now, you know. Okay. So even Prague is becoming more multicultural now. Every time I go there, it's different. It's changing a lot. Hopefully for the better. Even though sometimes I think some of the politics are a bit bizarre. I don't quite understand what's going on there politically. But then again, it's pretty bizarre in Australia also when you think about politics here. It's very, very strange. So, you know, and then Trump on top of it. You know.
Who knows what's going on?
I had to mention him. I I hope I won't, but I hoped I won't, but somehow Trump slipped in.
He gets his way everywhere.
As a part of the bizarreness, really.